Setting up shop.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Setting Up Shop. So I'm your host, Dan, from a woodturner from the UK. And with me, as always, are Rasmus, a blacksmith from Norway, and Heidi, a potter from America. Hello to you again, both.
Hello.
There's always that pause there, as if they're not sure if I should say anything or not. But, that's fine. We'll get there at some point. It's season 3. We might actually work up a sort of a lead in and a lead out at some point in time. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot of things over the last 2 seasons. The one thing that's been brought up, was mentioned to us a number of times, was talking about product development. So all 3 of us make the things that we sell, and obviously that inspiration has got to come from somewhere. The lead into it, the design, the idea, and why we're going to make it has all come from somewhere. So we thought this would be a good time to have that conversation and maybe retell some of our stories about things that haven't necessarily gone so well, or maybe they've been made really well but haven't sold so well, and to look at a few things around that and to see if there's anything there we can help people with in that regard. Raz, I'm going to start with you on this one, on the basis that out of the 3 of us, you're the one who struggles to stop product developing.
I have no idea what you mean.
And quite possibly doesn't necessarily have, shall we say, an organized technique for how he product develops. But in some ways you also sort of do. And I don't think you're even necessarily aware of it. But could you start with how, not where the ideas come from, because that will be very diverse, but when you've had an idea, how you then go about creating it in the format you think, and just pick one product and just talk us through that if you can.
Well, one thing I've actually worked a little bit on today is a blacksmith finishing wax that is really, really dark black and goes on kind of easy. I've used my own recipe for a long while, but I haven't sort of finalized a recipe for it. I've always been a bit mixing up and trying different things every single time I made a new batch. But after I keep teaching more and more, and I reuse my wax when I have the classes, and people every so often will ask, well, do you sell this? That's kind of a good indicator of, well, maybe I should. If I already have more or less the infrastructure to manufacture this, then maybe I also should try to see if I can scale it up just enough to see if the product is viable, and then maybe find someone who can do manufacturing for me, because it doesn't require specialized equipment in that sense, but it does require very little of my expertise and knowledge, and it's very easily outsourced to someone who is doing similar things. And Dan, you put me on this a while back, that we talked about this ages ago, and yeah, this is definitely something someone else can do for me if I can find a recipe and all of that.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So you've brought up a couple of things there. First of all is the term viable.
Yeah.
What do you mean by whether or not the product is viable?
For now, it is just to see, can I manufacture something consistently that I'm happy with and feel comfortable selling? And how scalable is this? If I'm selling 20 tins a year, that's easy enough for me just to make extra when I do it and have them on the shelf and then chuck them out when people order. If I suddenly realize I'm selling 20 in the first month or 2, then we are approaching the range where, well, maybe I should find someone else to do this for me, because then maybe I can do a bit of a push to hit the rest of Europe and not just be inside of Norway.
Okay, so your viability, you're basing that on volume of sales across a year, let's say, or across a period of time. You're not necessarily reflecting it on viability as a cost-effective product.
I need to make my hourly rate no matter what.
Yeah.
And with that in mind, I don't really care what I spend my time doing, as long as it's actually have a reasonable chance of giving me a return on the time invested.
Yeah.
So I'm not picky about the fact that, I only want to forge like these fun things I saw on YouTube the last week because that's the new hype thing and I'm really excited about it. That's a dangerous route.
Yeah.
But if I'm able to just say like, no, I just need to get bread on the table. How can I do that this week? I just need to spend X hours into Forge, and usually that's okay.
Okay. So leaving aside the the blasé kind of full-time manner of I'll earn money by it as long as I put this time in, which we can't deny works for you, Raz. So we shouldn't be. I was going to say skeptical. I think the more appropriate word is jealous at your way in which you feel able to do that. But so you've got a product, and so the driving force behind your product development for making it a product as opposed to making it something that you utilized yourself. So you're changing it from I was going to say a tool, that's not necessarily the best descriptor of it, but changing it from part of your own production to being a product that you sell. The driving force behind that was because people asked you, do you sell this at one of your lessons?
Yeah.
So this is a really good thing. I don't think we've covered teaching as a subject, but that should probably be noted as a future one. It's really, really a good idea when you're teaching or doing a demonstration, anything that you use during that class, have either it or a comparable item available for people to either sell or direct them to your website. Because if you're stood there in front of them and you've just shown them that it works really well, they're much more likely to pay you then and there for that item because they trust you and you've sold it to them, even if they can get it cheaper somewhere else. And that's not unethical, but we'll have a whole other conversation about that in the future. So that's been your driving motivator, is you've had enough people ask, can I buy this? That makes you want to then possibly spruce the tin up a bit, maybe consider some form of labeling. And also the conversation you've had with me about, because that's an important question, is do you continue to make it? You're a blacksmith, but now you're looking into the realm of making finishes, which is an art all in itself. And what exactly is the end result? You're looking at, I've got a product I can then sell, but you haven't, the bit that's missing is possibly the market research then to see how much of that per year is that going to be. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, it is. And now leading up to Christmas is sort of why I am looking into this as a product. Because if I can get this on my website, it can easily be like a stocking filler someone would buy for a blacksmith or a metalworker in their life. So if I can get this more or less figured out in the next few weeks, then I have a month or so of marketing before I'm approaching the deadline of shipping things before Christmas.
Yeah.
That's my vague thinking about why I want to prioritize this instead of all the other stuff I technically should have been doing. Okay.
That sounds good. So as a comparison then, Heidi, if you pick one of your products that I'm sure you're familiar with, what was the driving force behind the origins of that and going forward?
Sure. So a lot of times my product development is customer driven. So say a one-off customer or even a company comes to me and says, like, can you make this thing? Historically, it's been a mug, right? Like most of my clientele are using the mugs to fundraise or sell products that has their naming convention on it or something like that. But if it's something more home goods or something a little bit outside of that reach, either it's because I want to push myself to like come up with something new to like add to my repertoire, or like, for instance, recently someone from the Armenian community asked me if I could develop some products for them because they can't find these certain bowls and warmers in the United States. They're just really struggling to find them, and there's a pretty big Armenian community here.
Okay.
So they've shared with me like what the product is and how it's used. And so I'll start ideating about like, can I replicate it with the material that I already use? Or is it a separate type of process or firing technique or those kind of things to make it work for what the end use is? And then I'll have to do a couple of prototyping phases, which I have to determine whether I'm taking the cost on for the prototyping or I'm passing the cost on to the client. And that's all dependent on like what their goal is specifically. Are they expecting to resell these? Are they just looking to buy a lot of them? By a lot, I mean like a number, a lot. So in that case, I would need to figure out like what the retail value is and then try and come up with a number that would cover my ideation time and my product development time, unless I feel like it's something that could be more broad than just them.
Yeah.
And I would sell it to other places, which, could very well turn out to be that case, because it might be a product that for this community, it's used for this, but like elsewhere, it might be something else with just some minor adjustments, and it would be utilized something slightly different.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get into too much detail about what the product is until
you don't want to reveal
it. Until I get it kind of figured out. It's a very fresh thing. But I do spend a lot of time in my sketchbook. I do spend a lot of time doing research to see, are these things being sold elsewhere? What's the price comparison? Where are they being sold? I typically will set up like a Pinterest board. It sounds very 40-year-old woman, but I do use Pinterest to like collect images and see if I can, make something my own. And then I'll go into like prototyping phase where I'll just kind of throw several different versions based on my illustration, fire it. And in this case, I would need to test to make sure that it works for the end user purpose, make sure that it can withstand the use that it's going to be. So for pottery, some of the considerations are going to be, is it too heavy? Is it thick enough to hold heat? Is it heat resistant? So if I'm going to use it in an oven, do I need to have special instructions for the end user to make sure that they don't blow it up in their oven? Or like if they're going to put hot coals in it, can it withstand the thermal shock? So that's kind of the fun part of it, is like trying to break it. But it's definitely, I don't always take these kind of things on, especially if they don't like strike an interest to me. I might say like, oh, hey, there's somebody else that can do this. But it's definitely one of the first questions that I have for them is like, what price point are you chasing?
Yeah.
Because ultimately I don't want to put the time and effort into building something unless I'm like super into it. And then find out that like, at the end of the day, they want to sell it for like $10 a unit. And you're like, it's handmade, man. Like, this is not like plastic formed in a third world country that, it's worth a little bit more than that. So there's a lot of questions. I feel like I need to make a cheat sheet for myself, because sometimes I get, I don't know about you guys, but like sometimes I get a little ahead of myself, especially if it's something I'm excited to like experiment with.
I was just going to say, maybe this is one of those things where we need to create a cheat sheet for everyone to have a look at, to see if this is something that they'd be helpful for. I know I've mentioned in the past about if you were going to specifically someone who's requested a commission, having a pre-list of questions that will help you so that you don't forget questions. But this is also another good one if they've come to you. So it's not a pre-planned meeting. You don't necessarily know what it's about. They've just suddenly fired you an email or a message on social media. I've got a returning customer come to me recently who works in London for a design company. And I'm very grateful to him because I don't think he fully understands capabilities of what a wood turner can and can't do. But rather than that being a negative, that's definitely a positive, because it means that he presents me with these things and goes, can you make me this? If not, why not? How can we do it? And he's presented a form that he wants me to replicate. An initial batch of 20 was what he said, with some loose designs and what it's going to end up being. And I've had a bit of back and forth with him, exactly as you've said, Heidi. So from a product development point of view, this is not my inspiration. So we've had Raz, who has already made a product, and now he's talking about how he can scale it up, how he can finalize a recipe for his particular product. Heidi's got sort of an existing sort of thing, and then someone's going, oh, can you make one of these, which may or may not be an adaptation of something you already make, or it's a slightly different form, or it's a stacking form, or whatever, or if you're really unlucky, it's a pot with a lid. Or a butter dish, I believe, is the other one. Whereas in my situation, someone's literally sent me a picture of a thing and said, can you make this? But even though this is what the thing is, I want to change it into a different thing. So it's going to serve a different function, but look like something else. And I've gone back to him those exact sort of questions that you've mentioned there, Heidi. So, what's the time scale? What's the end purpose? Like, are you reselling this? If so, when are you planning on reselling this? Is there an event you want it showcased for? What is the end thing going to look like? Do I need to worry about, in my case, he was very quick and came back and said it's going to be painted, which is great. So that means that for the size of the thing he's talking about, I can now glue bits of wood together because it's going to be covered up. That's not a problem. So there's an awful lot of, like you mentioned about weight of the item. He wants to make sure they're not too heavy, but they shouldn't be easily knocked over and all this kind of stuff. So there's the practical questions on product design that not all of us would necessarily think about. But equally, there's the flip side to that of they're not asking you to make 20 of the same thing, having never made one before. They're asking you, is it possible? And therefore, what is required to get you there? And so he actually has been very good and mentioned to me, I want a prototype. I want 2 different sized prototypes so that I can see what they're like. How do they work? Do I like them? I'm fortunate enough that he's happy to wait till the new year because I'm backed up with other stuff. So I've got a bit more time. It's given me time so that I can go, right, how would I do this process? And the question you raised there, Heidi, about, well, who pays for that? So how much time are you going to put into it to who pays for it? So again, asking that question of, hey, look, what's your end budget? Like, what were you thinking my time was going to be into this? How much were you budgeting for me to do it? I mean, he's a designer in London, so I'm, based on past experience, hoping he realizes that it's not going to be like £10 a piece. But that is actually a question I haven't asked him yet because I couldn't think of how to phrase the question. I was thinking of, what are you selling the end product for, which he's unlikely to want to tell me. Whereas what I should have asked, or can still ask, is what was your budget per piece for my work? Because if he comes back and he says under £100, then I can straight away tell him that it's not going to happen. And that's not going, even ignoring the prototype, making them in the thing is not going to happen. Particularly as he's told me he wants this to be a limited edition run of 100 in the end. So it's not, if you could see the shape, it would make sense, but we're having to be dance around things here because you're never sure who's watching or who's going to listen to things. And whilst no contracts have been signed, it's impolite to air that sort of thing before the product's out in the world. So with that vague kind of assimilation of both of the data that both of you had brought to the fore with the things that you're saying and some of the stuff I've mentioned, if we delve a little bit more into prototyping and what to do with the results. Something that I never appreciated when I was at school was the fact that a negative isn't a failure.
Yes.
Okay. A negative isn't a failure. It just gives you different data. So if you've tried making a thing the same way 3 times from different materials and all 3 of those things have failed, then it's not necessarily the materials that are wrong. It might be the method you're using to create the thing. And this is where, whether or not you're someone who puts the data in a spreadsheet, someone who scribbles it on the back of a scrap of paper or a notebook in your workshop, or you retain it all in your head, somewhere you need a way of remembering what happened last time and what you've changed. And it is basically doing science experiments, but if you're like me and you never really paid much attention to those, there is a reason why the scientific method was created, and it is exceptionally useful in product development, particularly when we're talking craft manufacturing or similar. So Raz, you've clearly got this twinkle in your eye and a grin on your face. Like, what happens to your prototypes? Come on.
No. I want to quote Adam Savage first, because he very eloquently said that the difference between doing science and just screwing around is writing stuff down.
Yeah, I like that.
Because and I try to be good about this. Sort of whenever I make something, I at least try to take some notes somewhere to say like, oh, I started with this stock, I marked these and these places, I used these and these techniques here and there, and this is how it went. Because even if this is just a fun experiment, fun bit of play, or a mad idea I had, it is always useful to have some notes to look back to later on. Especially if you then later have a customer come to you and go like, oh, I want this project. And you go, that sounds similar to something I already did, or using the similar techniques I already know. And then you can go like, oh, I can already give you a rough price point because I happen to take the notes on how long it took me to make that thing and the starting stock. And suddenly you're halfway down a conversation already without actually having to do any extra work.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you agree with that, Heidi?
Yeah, for sure. One thing that I think has been really helpful in this age of YouTube and Instagram is that we are typically, as makers, documenting as we work anyway, whether it's, Instagram Live or just stories on TikTok or whatever. Those are really great to archive and note back to. It may not be a written note, but being able to reference your visual library is super helpful. And one thing that I do is at the end of the year, or maybe like 6 months into the year, I'll create an album on my Google Photos that I'll just drag and drop all of my videos and stuff into, depending on, what I was working on. And I'll label, this folder is 2024 mugs. And then this one's 2024 home goods. And maybe there's like a folder that's like the best of, or, whatever, like finished product that actually sold. That way I have an archive that I can go back to year over year. And this also helps me when I'm selling in different options. So say you go through your product development, you know what the product is, but then someone's like, oh, what are my options for finishing?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, well, here are the colors that I have available, or here are the finishes that I have available, or, we can distress it, or, all of those things. So being able to also provide those albums out to your potential customer to say, like, here are your options if you're going to buy in bulk from me is super helpful. Besides just like knowing how, like for me, the biggest thing that I need to remember for future self is how much something weighed when I started. So if I'm making a batch out of, I have these little incense holders. If I'm making a batch out of those, I need to remember, that was a little under 1/2 pound to start with for weight. And that way it's consistent from production run to production run to production run. And then I also, because I have visual reference, I know like where I put my logo and what colors I produced year over year. So I always have a visual reference to go back to make things consistent.
Yeah. Yeah. Plus, looking back through old notebooks is cool. Like finding
Yeah.
random scribbles or notes and either wondering what the hell does that mean, or suddenly going, oh yeah, that thing that I was spend some time on at some point that from 2 years ago. Yeah, actually that would be really handy. And for those of you who have heard of and listened or watched any of Jimmy DeResta's stuff, he talks about that all the time, going through old notebooks and suddenly going, oh yeah, there's this project thing that I scribbled in the like just in the comments in the side whilst I was doodling whilst waiting for a train or something. And then you put the book away and you don't look at it again for months on end, and you suddenly find this thing. So I definitely find that whether or not it's on a tablet or on paper, some form of sketchable written format for storing your things is in some ways preferable. I would certainly find so when you're in a workshop space that is possibly a bit dirtier like mine or Rasmus's, where pulling out a digital item is not always advisable. But on the flip side to that is if it's all digital, like you said, a lot of it will quite often be recorded on social media or YouTube or whatever. So if we scale back then a little bit in the process, so I'm zipping around all over the place because, all of us neurodivergent people think in a linear path, so why not? The trigger for needing or wanting new products, which is two very different things, even though they can feel very much like the same thing. Raz, what would your trigger be for coming up with a new product?
Short answer, it depends.
Other than watching Lord of the Rings.
Well, then there's not much left. It depends a little bit. It's whether what I did with the roses early on is realizing I happen to be at a lot of markets with older women on them, but none of them tends to stop at my booth. Can I make something to try to capture some of those people? The steel roses ended up being that thing for me.
Can I just say, draw the attention of, not capture the old ladies?
Oh, yes. Sorry. Draw the attention of the old ladies. Yes. Suddenly this could be a whole different show.
Yeah. I mean, true crime podcasts are much more popular, so maybe we should carry on with the story. But
a spin-off, maybe. Yeah. Other thing is I notice, I need a thing. Maybe I can make this cool enough that other people also will want to buy it.
Okay, so if we take those two separately then, so the roses I think is fascinating. So the first part of that is that you noticed that there was a customer base that were avoiding your booth. Mm-hmm. So this is something that all of us may be aware that people aren't coming to buy from us, but not necessarily noticing who that customer base is or whatever. And maybe we need to take a step back and look around at what are the vast majority of the people attending, what is the age range, gender, which is a bit more fluid these days as to whether or not you can tell, but there are certain repeat factors of the groups of people attending the market you're at. Do you have something there that is likely that they would want to buy or is going to attract them to the stall? See back to previous episode about where you should dress your stall up and things you should include. But I like the fact, though, Raz, that you noticed that and so you came up with a product. My follow-up question to that is, though, did you actually then show that product to that potential customer base and ask if they like it, or did you just put it out on your stall?
I don't recall, first of all, because some of the very early markets that I did a fair bit of this product development on and sort of testing the viability of the products was with a lot of local people. So I had some familiarity with a lot of the people who would stop by my booth. So it was a lot easier for me to just look at their reaction and realize that, this is better, this is not, kind of. Okay. And didn't necessarily need to have that full-on conversation. At the same time, I had that conversation earlier, and then they come back to the next market and they go like, I really like this. This is good. So it wasn't me so much initiating that conversation. I was just lucky enough that I had enough of a community pop up around me that wanted to help me out and wanted to have that conversation with me. And sort of taught me how to have that conversation.
Okay, so that's good, because that what I like about that is the fact that for those people who are not so confident about directly speaking to people, but hopefully are very good at observing the way in which people react to things, would still be able to get the feedback from their product without having to potentially put themselves in that position that they feel uncomfortable in, of asking a stranger or a near stranger of, what do you think about my product? So you are still able to put your product out and witness the reaction to it. So you're getting the feedback, albeit not verbally or not written down. And I think that's an important message for some of our listeners who are possibly not quite so outspoken as myself or you are, Raz, and to a certain extent Heidi as well. Okay. What about yourself, Heidi? What would your trigger be for ignoring people coming to you and saying, "Can you make me this?" What would be your trigger for a personal product that you come up with?
Well, I can point back to something that came up a few years ago, and I really enjoyed making them. I had learned about a product that was for harvest season. So it's called an apple baker.
Okay.
And the apple baker is basically a bowl with a spike, and you core your apple and then you put it over top of the spike. And you may take the skin off if you want. And then you put some spices and things over top of it, like as if you were doing an apple pie, like cinnamon and sugar and brown sugar and stuff. Put it over it and then bake it in the oven. And it tastes like, it's basically apple pie without the pie crust.
That's the best bit.
I mean, for some people, it is. But it was super fun to make, number one, because it's just so like ridiculous looking. But it also was an opportunity for me to pull people into my booth to talk about what the heck that thing is, because it's not super top of mind what it would be. And then I was able to like give it out to friends and say like, hey, you know, is this something that you'd be interested in? So I did like limited batches during the falls. So it doesn't have to be something that's like always in my shop, but it's something that I can optionally make during the harvest.
Yeah.
That kind of ties into that, like that time period of the year. And I don't feel so overwhelmed by having to make them all of the time. And it gives me a reason to like refresh my shop and get more people engaged in my newsletters and those kind of things when I come out with them.
Yeah.
When I first did them, I did like a limited batch. I asked my social media how many people would be interested. And then I just added 10% to the pre-orders, and they sold pretty well. A lot of people had never seen them before, and I got a lot of reviews on it. So it was super fun. So, I mean, for me, it's typically, I'm bored. I'm bored of making mugs. I'd like to come up with some new thing that I can have. And normally it's a seasonal item. Like last year I did pumpkin planters. So there's pumpkins with faces, and they were planters, and they went really well.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm a off the cuff person when it comes to that type of product development.
Okay, interesting. I think one of the triggers for me is that it's got, not that it's got to be, but something certainly that I find is a driver for me to want to make it, is that it's something either I've not made before, or it will further my skills and techniques by challenging me to a certain degree. Although what that does mean is that I spend longer not making it because I'm pondering it and being scared of giving it a go, which is, as we all know, ridiculous, because no one else is telling you to make it and it's all in your own head. And so why not? Which is also interestingly why when people are coming to me with some of these potential batch commission things that 4 years ago I would have said, yeah, I can't do that. I'm now looking at it and going, why not?
Mm.
You know, what's stopping me from do that? Is it technique? Is it skill level? Is it time? Is it money? Which one of those is it actually? And if it is one of those, how can I get around that and move myself forward? So it's also a little bit that you hinted at there as well, Heidi, is keeping your product range fresh. So if we step outside of all three of our disciplines, if you were a card maker and all year round you kept happy birthday, happy Christmas, you know, sorry you're leaving, all of the usual card types, and you had them there all year round, people are eventually going to, or very quickly going to stop looking at your ranges because there isn't a change, there isn't the new thing, there isn't something that is different. But conversely, if you're bringing out a new thing every week, people can't keep up.
Yeah.
But they're going to stop looking as well, because it's just going to be, oh, you're not actually invested in the product you've made. This is like a flash in the pan. They might suspect that maybe you're not even making them yourself, which if you're not, that's absolutely fine, you know. But it's that whole thing of, is it home designed or handmade or whatever the case may be? There seems to be a fine line at the moment where more and more people are suspecting honest hand-making people that they're not making it by hand anymore, that it's being bought in from a third world or whatever. And some people are claiming, well, I've designed it and then I've got someone to make it for me, so therefore technically it's mine because it's my design. I had someone try and tell me that a couple of months ago, but what they were talking about was spoons. So I would argue that it wasn't their original design. It's a spoon. Yeah. That aside, I think all three of us there have got, you know, reasons for coming up with a new product can be quite different. The one that I think all three of us would probably have is randomly seeing something either in a film or TV show, or when you're in a shop, or you're walking down the street, or you see a friend using something and you go, ooh, what's that? I've not seen one of those before. I've not played with one of those before, or that's an interesting form or shape or thing. Or sometimes it can just be, I like the noise that thing made in that thing I saw. How do I replicate that type idea? And that can send you down a little inspiration journey of sometimes dangerously trying to crowbar a product into a range you already have where it doesn't really fit, but because you're determined to do the thing you saw because you thought it was cool. On that note, as all of us, I'm sure, have occasionally done that, how long do you keep putting something out for sale before you take it off the public space and you retire it for a period of time because you realize that possibly you shouldn't have made that product and that was more of a product for you than it was for the public because you didn't do your market research? You just thought, oh, this is a cool thing, I'm going to make it and people will buy it. And then you're surprised when it doesn't happen, despite the fact you've not actually asked anyone, it doesn't meet your customer base, and you're not selling it in the right place. So how quickly would you be willing to retire a piece like that, Raz?
For me, mostly just based on the fact that I already have a stupid amount of ideas. I can do that really quickly, but it will often be based upon the space I have to display things. If I have a new thing, I want it to show it off. I want to see how viable it is out in the real world. But if I go to 2-3 markets and it doesn't sell at all, then maybe I'll stop bringing it. Maybe I'll stop showing it off just because it is taking up real estate space. I should use that space for something else that probably will sell. So I don't have a good rule for that.
So the question's got to be, you say replace it with something that will sell. Do you mean something you already know historically sells well, or do you mean the next new thing?
Usually we're talking about me being at the market and it's like, well, I have less space than the last market I was at. This thing didn't sell. Okay, I'm not displaying that. Because then I would have to display less of something else. And because I have, for example, a good variety of bottle openers or just leaf hooks, having the full range of that on display would probably look better and sell better than having a little bit of something completely different that's all new and doesn't sell, but it limits the amount of everything else. It's it's also a bit of that psychology thing of abundance, that if you have a lot of something on display, that gives psychologically a whole other impression than if there's only one of them. If you are an artisan only making one of things and you want to portray that, having only one of things at displays is kind of the way to go. But for me, when I have like my best sellers are heart hooks and roses, if I only have one rose and one heart hook out, they will not sell as well.
Yeah.
If I have 5, 8, or 10 in slightly different sizes and things like that on display, like, not only am I telling people this can look good together with multiples of the same thing, but also I'm showing like this is something popular. Other people tends to buy this thing.
Cool.
That's my rant.
Was that a rant? That sounded far too cheerful to be a rant.
Oh, okay. What's the opposite of a rant then?
I don't know. That's a whole other conversation.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
So we've spoken a little bit about asking our customers for feedback, or asking them, sort of reaching out to them and doing some market research and that kind of thing. How much, Heidi, do you use technology to your advantage in that kind of a conversation?
Well, obviously, when I'm creating something new that I'm ready to share, that I'm creating something new, I do a lot of stories. I do a lot of just random broadcasts of the process of what I'm doing in development, so I can create some kind of exchange and excitement for it. One of the things that I've been learning about through my day job a bit more is utilizing things like SurveyMonkey for my existing client base, just to like add on to a newsletter or something, just to say like, hey, if I made this, would this pique your interest? And maybe it's like, you want to limit it to maybe 3 questions with just maybe option A, option B, option C, option D, versus, giving people an opportunity to like try and write a novel, just like the very specific points that you want answered. Like, when was the last time you purchased something from my shop? What would encourage you to buy something from my shop? What do you like? If I branched out and made garlic bowls or, XYZ, would you be interested in buying them? Yes or no? Or you could do like a scale, like from 1 to 5, like how much would this interest you? Now, if you have like only 5 people on your newsletter, you may not really get any respondents, but if you have like 200 plus people that are recipients of your newsletter, you could probably anticipate maybe like 10% response. And even that 10% response, you can start building some really good feedback, because usually those are the people that really care about you and your business and want to see you grow. And I found that also like utilizing the surveys and giving people an opportunity to help you with creating a product makes them more excited when it does come out. And if you can keep building that momentum with your audience, and I guess this kind of goes back to like marketing and social media more or less. But if you keep building the momentum of like, hey, this is where we're at with the development, and here are the options that I've come up with, which one's your favorite? It can kind of, it's got multiple prongs that help you in your business, not just with the product development, but also it gives people more of this feeling that they're part of the story too, which is really great. And it also can kind of incentivize you too, in a way, to like keep it going, versus like, oh, I had this idea and I started doing it, but then I thought it was stupid, so I didn't go forward. Which I think a lot of, and Dan, I think you were kind of talking through that a little bit, like your own personal hurdles that cause you to maybe not pursue something because it's like, I talked myself out of it.
Yeah, very, very much so. And I can make something and then it fails the first time. And as I've already mentioned, that's a negative, isn't necessarily a bad thing. But myself personally, I very quickly go, that's failed, therefore it's a failure, therefore why should I bother carrying on? And I have to consciously talk myself around from that, knowing full well that just because something failed when it's made of wood doesn't mean that the technique was wrong. It could be the wood itself had an inherent flaw that I wasn't aware of. It could be I used the wrong technique, the wrong tool, such. And it's something to be scientific method about and question and go, right, why did it fail? Let's go back and analyze it again. And it's definitely something that I still have to fight with, but I've definitely grown over the last few years about recognizing that kind of thing rather than just having a hissy fit and throwing my toys out the pram and deciding that it's all because I'm useless and I am terrible and have no skills whatsoever and I'm a complete fraud.
I think that is probably, if you're a solopreneur, that's one of the places where it's the most difficult space to be in because you get so internalized with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I think it is tantamount to success to share what you're working on, whether that's parasocially or within your family or coworkers or something, just to like, not everybody is going to like toot your horn, but most people are going to be really excited because most people don't produce things outside of like, you know, they might do something for themselves, like build something for their garden, but we're in such a small, like, I know all of us are so like our circle of friends are makers. And it can be very deceiving for us to think like everyone makes things. And sometimes you have to go outside of that circle to realize like what's so special about what you're doing and what's so unique about what you're doing, and getting that encouragement throughout the product development stages. I think it's incredible. Like, I came to work this morning with some good news and shared it with my coworkers, and we all like kind of all excitedly talked about it. And it had nothing to do with my day job. It had everything to do with my pottery. And it's just like really fun to just be like, hey guys, check this out. And I don't know. It's just like they have their things, right? The one guy fishes all the time and he gets excited about the big bass he pulled out of the water. My thing is obviously getting really dirty with clay. Yeah.
Cue Unchained Melody. So that it's a very valuable point to make. And I was just thinking back on, a couple of weekends ago, I went on a 3-day wood turning retreat. Make it sound more glamorous than it was. One of the exercises was turning a bowl and trying to maintain an even wall thickness of the bowl. And at the end of the exercise, the instructor took the one he had made and, to prove a point, cut it in half on the bandsaw to then show people the consistency of the thickness across the shape. Now, that was the end as far as he was concerned. He was just showing people, okay, I've made this thing. This is what you're aiming for. But in the reality is you're never going to see that unless you were to cut the thing in half. Yeah. And a number of others in the group who he didn't ask for it, but they volunteered and said, well, can you cut mine in half? Because I want to know. Not me. I chickened. I was like, no, I'm quite happy with this. Thank you very much. It's smooth and lovely. And I will retain that as a good foundation. But I was just thinking from a prototyping perspective, if you were one thing that you should be doing, like you said earlier, Heidi, with prototypes is looking for the flaws. Okay, so if you're making a product, for instance, that is going into someone's home, you want to make sure that you know how it's likely to break before they break it and they return it to you. So one of the ways that I would be able to do that is okay, I'm going to make my finished product, and now I'm going to consciously cut it in half to see, okay, was I a bit thin here, or is that a bit, is this fracturable or whatever? What happens if I drop the piece? What happens if I submerge it in water? What happens if I put it in fire? I mean, wood, it will burn. But from your point of view, Heidi and Raz, what happens if these different scenarios? What happens if a child puts this in their mouth? What happens if a pet gets hold of it? All of those kind of things, depending on the products that you're making and what the end use is intended for, are things you could test for. I'm not saying you have to, I'm not saying you should, but if you were truly product testing it, if I pour liquid into it, how long does it hold it before it leaks? If I pour hot liquid into it, how long does it hold it before it leaks? If I put tomato soup in it, does it stain it? All of that kind of thing. And like you said, Heidi, that can be the really fun thing. But that's the sort of thing that only comes about because we were in a group setting and someone of a higher skill level showed it and it triggered something off. But I haven't thought of those other parts of the process until we're having that conversation now with two other like-minded people. Again, that's all insular. We're all creative people, we're all makers. But if we try to have that conversation again with a different group of people who don't think like that, the questions they ask us are just as valuable, because other than what's it for or why would you do that, we have to accept that those will be asked. But some people might just say, oh, that seems a bit heavy for whatever it is they're using it for. And everyone else who's a creative person possibly has, maybe we're younger, maybe we have a better grip strength or whatever because we work with our hands all the time. And maybe the customer base we're trying to make it and sell it to is an older generation. Maybe they're not going to be able to pick the thing up. So it's very much good to talk to people outside of the group of friends, outside of the creative sphere in that regard. But yeah, you were talking about, the initial question was about using technology and surveys and all of that kind of stuff, and research and discussions. We're using technology now literally to have this conversation between 3 different countries and able to have this kind of conversation. Most people, particularly if they're listening to us now, have got a mobile phone. They've got the ability to have conversations with other people, whether or not that's just written word, audio notes, video, whatever they like. And I think it's very important to remember that the only way you can really develop a product going forwards is to constantly ask for feedback. Whether that's from colleagues, fellow makers, family members, or the customer base, it relies on feedback. Otherwise, it's not going to necessarily ever reach its final development.
Yep, I couldn't agree more.
Excellent. I think we'll probably end on that comment unless either of you have a particular point you wanted to go carry on with.
Well, yeah, I want to mention sort of the dangers of the rabbit hole of continuous product development.
Well, no one knows them better than you, Rasmus. Go ahead.
Yeah. I would often have to limit myself, or either into time I'm investing, quote unquote, now, or set a deadline to say, like, I need this to be finished by this date, or I have to reach this stage of development by this date, if I want this to be a product for like the next market, this Christmas season or whatever. Because without that, I will either never get to finishing it. I will have lots of notes, lots of prototypes kicking about, but never actually finished anything. Or I would just spend forever trying to iterate and improve upon it. And it will just be a thing that just kicks about. And I never reach the point of saying, like, this is good enough for what it needs to be now. And then try to, either if that's just, oh, I would love for it to have all of these extra features. And I was like, yeah, but let's just see if the basic function works first, right? Or when it comes to the wax now, it's just like, well, I just need to land on a recipe and then ask what the community thinks about that. And then see how many pre-orders I get, and then make my first batch out of the blacksmith wax from there. If I'm making a tool, it's kind of like, well, what is the core functionality of it? Can I make that thing work so well that without any extra bells and whistles, it will sell and work and people will be happy with it? And then you can start to add things on, make things better, easier, manufacturing and all of that. But I think it's important, especially if it is for me, it is important to set some boundaries around the whole development process just to reach a finish line.
Yes, absolutely. And notice, ladies and gentlemen, listeners, that he said good enough, not finished.
Oh yeah. Nothing I produce is ever perfect or finished. It only reaches a point of good enough where I don't cry if I send it off to the customer.
Yeah, it's not a good. Well, sometimes it's a good idea, but it's not always a good idea to go back and look at work that maybe you've given to family members earlier on in your maker journey. Sometimes it can be interesting. Other times it can be a little bit cringeworthy. Yeah, a mark of, I think, of a good craftsperson is someone who is constantly evolving the way they do things and making sure the next one is better than the last one. Excellent. So, on that note, we really hope that everyone is enjoying this series. We don't get a huge amount of feedback, mainly because we're not necessarily very prolific on social media. So that might be, our bad, which is entirely understandable. We have now got 4 Patreon supporters, and we thank you very much to all 4 of you. We need to decide what we're going to do with expanding the Patreon range, and whether or not we need to increase a higher tier so that we can have people who wish to have their name shouted out and championed, or maybe their business shouted out even, so that we can give back a little bit more, something like that. Any ideas on that scheme, let us know. And you would let us know by emailing info@settingupshop. I think my brain's gone dead now as to what the email address is. That doesn't sound right.
I believe
Please hold.
It is correct. info@settingupshop.com.
It is info@settingupshop.com. Setting Up Shop. Shop spelled SHOPPE. Or you can message us individually. So you can message me on Instagram @BevelWoodUK. You can get hold of Rasmus @LoenSmed.
Still, no, it's Rasmus Loen.
Rasmus Loen.
Rasmus Loen on all the socials, and then the website is loensmed.no.
If you are consistent across the board, I would remember it at some point. It's
I am consistent.
Of language things. Did you say it's loensmed.com?
No.
So it's loensmed.no, but it's @Rasmus Loen.
Yeah,
but
because
you're claiming
company and me. It's simple.
That's a separate podcast episode all the way there. And you can get hold of Heidi at Whitehall Pottery. There we go. Thank you very much, everyone. We do hope you're still enjoying it. Please tell us if you're not. You'll probably have told us by stop listening. But please do tell us if you are enjoying it and anything else you'd like us to consider. And until next time, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.